as Joe already introduced to you, much of the content I'm going to present today draws from two sources. The first one is the APA report that we just saw on the screen, and I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this report. They were instrumental in also developing a great WUI product. So they were Anna Reed, Kelly Johnston, and Tarek Wafai. And collectively, we represent different backgrounds in planning, forestry, wildfire mitigation, and fire behavior. I'm also going to use and draw from a lot of community examples that are based on work I've done through the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program. Our acronym for that is CPAW. This is a program that my organization co-founded with Headwaters Economics, which is a nonprofit research and policy group based out of Bozeman, Montana. And the CPAW program is funded by the USDA Forest Service and private foundations. And we provide technical planning assistance to communities, as you can see here, across the country. So acceptance into the program is on a competitive basis, but for those communities that get selected, the assistance comes at no charge. And it's really focused on how communities can address their plans and regulations to better integrate and align with wildfire risk reduction and mitigation strategies, some of which I will highlight today. So as we think about land use planning tools and strategies that can be used to address the WUI, I first want to underscore a point that Miranda made, which is that the WUI exists across the country. And this is just a very small sampling of different areas that can look quite different in terms of their densities, their rural or urban character, topography, type and extent of vegetation, and other conditions. And these different conditions in the WUI will really influence how a wildfire affects an area. So for example, this diagram shows a continuum of different urban densities and development patterns, from highly rural to highly urban. And some of these areas may be more susceptible to ignitions by direct flame contact, such as those areas that are rural areas that are adjacent to wildland areas. And there are other areas that may be more susceptible to embers, such as very highly urbanized residential areas that may be further away from a wildland area, but they're still in what we would consider an ember zone. So you can see some of these differences by looking at this example. This is a more dispersed, lower density development pattern of home loss in a rural area that was affected by the Black Forest Fire in Colorado. And you can compare that to slightly higher density suburban area, such as this example from South Carolina, that was affected by wildland flame contact and embers during the Highway 31 fire several years ago. So once, in this case, in some places in the neighborhood where one home was affected, there were subsequent home-to-home ignitions that occurred. There's some really interesting research coming out of some case studies in California about how density and loss are connected. And so where that may not be applicable yet to other places in the country, I think it's an ongoing conversation that we're actively having as planners and researchers on which density pattern lends itself more to overall loss in the WUI. When we look more closely at the WUI and what makes the WUI susceptible to wildfire, we really have to think about fuels both in terms of the natural and the built environment. And wildland fuels in this case can be either natural or cultivated vegetation. And built fuels can be any type of structure such as homes or businesses, and or also include infrastructure. So these conditions can sometimes be obvious, or sometimes they're less obvious, such as in this example. And I'm showing these different examples because they're all communities we've worked with that were either directly affected or threatened by wildfire. This is another example of the wildland fuels and built fuels. Again, some being more obvious, others being less obvious. But again, these were all areas affected, WUI areas that were affected by wildfire. So when we're planning for wildfire in the WUI, we first really have to broaden our thinking about the WUI itself. And in the case of the PAS report, we frame the WUI as any developed area where conditions affecting the combustibility of both the natural and cultivated vegetation, so those wildland fuels, combined with the structures or infrastructure, the built fuels, allows for ignition and spread of fire. And so we're really looking at this, complex dynamic. And the PAS report goes into a lot more detail on fire behavior and the science behind ignitions. So once we fully understand the conditions of the WUI and how things burn in the WUI, we can start thinking about which planning and regulatory tools are available and appropriate to use. So I've listed many plans and regulations here. I'm going to highlight just some of the tools we use at different scales, and again, the PAS report goes into a lot more detail. So first, at the community scale, we really have to align our growth and development decisions with an appropriate wildfire hazard or risk map. And I say this because it can be confusing sometimes for people to think about the WUI map, which, as Miranda showed, shows a really good example of where the vegetation and the development exists, but it's not a predictive map for where wildfire is necessarily going to occur or what the risk is. And so we need to take it to the next step of identifying first, where's the WUI, but then where's the wildfire hazard? And so when we think about, what's the level of hazard and can we mitigate that area enough to make it safe, or should we avoid any type of development in that area altogether? So this identification process should feed into all appropriate community plans and codes. And once these wildfire hazard areas are identified, they form the basis of future decisions, such as whether they should be protected by conservation easements or development agreements or dedications or any other kind of set aside with the intent of keeping some of these high hazard areas, keeping them away from where development would occur in the future. When development is allowed, we have to think about the different land uses that should be or could be evaluated, and not just residential development, which I think is kind of the default mode of thinking is with the WUI, but we have to think a little bit beyond that of any built structure or of the infrastructure that we mentioned. So for example, when we encourage communities, or when we work with communities, we encourage them to really evaluate the types of vulnerable, hazardous, or temporary uses that they may allow in the WUI. And this is an example of a lumber yard, but other uses may include hospitals or critical facilities or outdoor festivals. So the community can require certain mitigation actions as part of the approval process to ensure that if these facilities or activities are allowed, there's still appropriate mitigation measures that are taken to reduce wild community and the surrounding areas. So when lands are set aside for something like open space or parks, we also encourage communities to ensure that these areas undergo fire mitigation during development, if that's still an option, and there's long-term maintenance that would occur as well. So if they're properly managed, these features can really, sometimes anyway, serve as buffers between high wildfire hazard areas and neighborhoods or other uses. They may also support fire response efforts. For example, they could improve access to different wildland areas. So the key point, though, is that planning for these areas should really link the open space or community forestry plan with other wildfire hazard maps and plans. So we always encourage local planners to work with their urban forester or their natural resource managers or partners for this type of activity. So we don't expect land use planners necessarily to have all the answers, but to collaborate with other resource managers and land managers that would be able to inform this topic. And I see there are questions, which look great. The quick answer is yes, that was a map of Chelan County, Washington. And we'll get to the other questions that are coming up when we're talking about when we have the open discussion. So I just want to acknowledge that. So at the subdivision scale, many of you that do work in the WUI are probably more familiar with this strategy of looking at water supply and access. Water supply for neighborhoods, such as hydrants, are often required when fire flow and pressure allows. Roads can and should also be required to meet specific standards for minimum widths or maximum grades and the number of turnarounds. This ensures, of course, adequate access by fire apparatus and equipment. And then road signs can also be required to meet uniform standards to ensure visibility. There's also sometimes requirements for secondary or emergency access for neighborhoods. Again, we always encourage local planners to work with their fire department or fire protection districts for this type of activity. So for example, in these pictures, we encourage planners to think about the conditions that would occur under a wildfire scenario when it's smoky, there's limited visibility, and first responder or public safety might be compromised. And I think, maybe this could have been a poll here, but the two pictures on the left of the limited dead end and the no outlet are, these are not good examples. These are examples where, we have to question what is the safety in the situation where if a wildfire were to occur. And so these are things that we sometimes, we want to avoid on the front end, but we also want to think about if communities are already here, is there a way to retrofit some of these services? Setbacks are another opportunity for planners to make development decisions at the subdivision scale. This can ensure that structures are separated from significant features. We mentioned forested areas that could also include steep slopes or ravines or other large-scale site conditions that affect fire behavior. This is an example here from Wenatchee, Washington. Some of you might be familiar with it. This was after the Sleepy Hollow fire, which affected a neighborhood that was kind of perched at the edge of this ravine. And so when the neighborhood rebuilt, the city required that the properties were set back further from the slope. And this also allowed for more vegetation management on the individual properties, which you can see in the lower right picture. Vegetation management of hazardous fuels can also be required for neighborhoods or subdivisions, including the implementation of larger scale treatments near homes and throughout neighborhoods, such as parks and open space that might be managed collectively. This can occur during the development phase, again, ideally, and then it would be maintained through development or HOA agreements. This image shows also where fire carried through the subdivision. This was the Waldo Canyon fire, and it says 2015, my apologies, it was actually in 2012. But this occurred, and there was a post-fire study that did confirm the direction of where the fire went. And as you can see, this also reconfirms that the setbacks, let me see if I can grab my cursor here, setbacks in this area also played a role in where some of these homes survived, and then some of these homes that were closer to the edge were more directly affected by the fire. So at the building and lot scale, moving down, we also talk quite frequently about landscaping standards. And on individual sites, this can mean requiring the use of fire-resistant plants based on acceptable plant lists, having defined defensible space standards in place. Going back to that Sleepy Hollow fire example, this is a different image of where homeowners rebuilt with improved landscaping, and they removed also highly combustible mulches near the home, which is another best practice. Just to drive that point home, I'm going to go back to the South Carolina example, which again, it's really easy to think about these innocent plants and shrubs that really don't seem like a big deal. I mean, this is very limited landscaping near a home. But when there is a receptive fuel bed for embers to land, it really does not take much for that ignition to occur. In this case, it's a perfect example of where fire suppression intervened. The vinyl in the windows were broken. The vinyl started melting, but the firefighters were able to suppress the house so it only was damaged and not fully destroyed. And so this confirms the science that we really rely on from the Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety and the U.S. Forest Service, that first 5 feet next to the structure or any attachment should really be maintained as a non-combustible zone. And then finally, building materials and construction standards. And again, planners may not have, in all cases, direct oversight over, for instance, the building code, but we encourage planners strongly to be familiar with these concepts because, it's part of the overall picture of WUI safety for structures. So building materials includes roofing materials, vents, siding, gutters, windows. These should all be, and there are all different kinds of ignition resistant and non-combustible standards in place to rely on. They may also apply these building standards to accessory dwelling units or sheds or other structures that pose a vulnerability. So I always encourage people to think of not just the size as the threshold or is the structure over a certain square footage, but is a relationship to other structures on a lot. So these requirements are often included, or I should say adopted at the local or the state level. On a side note, let me go back to that one moment because I think this is a really important point that recently after the Paradise Fire in California, which many of you will probably be familiar with, at least through the news coverage, they found that there's a study done on the effectiveness of the building code, and about 51% of the 350 single-family homes that were built after 2008 that were in the path of the Camp Fire were undamaged. So in other words, over half of the homes that were built that were subject to the California state required building codes survived. And this was compared to only 18% of the homes that were built prior to 2008. So there's a big difference in this case in the effectiveness of that code. Those figures don't include mobile homes, but I just thought I would point that out because the questions often come up is, how do we know that this works? Well, we have a lot of examples. A few other key topics. Again, the PAS report takes a much closer look at how WUI concepts can be integrated with other local, state, and federal frameworks and plans and regulations. In some of these discussions, we also make many references to resources. This includes the International Code Council's WUI code and the National Fire Protection Association standards for the WUI. And I think the key point is that the WUI planning, or WUI planning in general, really can't happen in isolation. We don't expect planners to know intimately all of these resources, but we want them to know where to go and who to work with. So along those lines, we really emphasize collaboration in all of our work. As a land use planner who has been doing wildfire planning work for over 10 years, I still know there's so much information I don't know about particularly forestry or land management. So I'm always working with other professionals, or when we're working with communities, we're getting information from the community members directly to really help inform the local context. We work all over the country, and it's really exciting to hear the stories and the experiences of local community members that can share and inform our process to make it better. Finally, again, I just wanted to put in another plug for the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program. You'll find, in addition to the PAS report that we've been highlighting, a number of really great resources on this website. You'll also find community examples and some of the project recommendations that we've provided to some of these communities and other free resources. So if you need some bedtime reading or extracurricular activities of reading and studying up on the WUI and some wildfire recommendations, these are some really great resources. And again, we've been sharing our contact information. This is mine. You're welcome to get in touch with me directly, and I'll turn it back to Nasheen so we can take more questions. Thanks.